Powerful and devoted, in the purest of hearts and a bloodline that has brought immense joy and pain to the galaxy. A man who achieved several destinies through sheer willpower alone. A galactic legend for all eras. A wise man and skilled negotiator who inadvertently played a crucial role in the fall of the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order. Forced into exile, he ensured that the Jedi would never be truly gone by protecting and training the Skywalker twins. If the two were forced into a battle against each other, who would come out on top? This is the topic for this edition of the Star Wars Lads vs. series, Episode 2, Luke Skywalker vs. Obi-Wan Kenobi. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Star Wars Lads vs. series. Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi is the OG Master and Apprentice relationship. And while there's no canonical animosity or time for some real competitiveness between the two to occur, I have always gone back and forth on who would win in a hypothetical fight versus each other. In the Legends timeline, Luke became a bit of a Force god, and he was very overpowered to the point that he knew all 7 lightsaber forms and a multitude of light side and dark side powers. But I never felt that made much sense with how the Empire had supposedly eradicated the Jedi Order's entire history, their artifacts, basically their effect on the galaxy as a whole. Anything that was material was missing. With Ewan McGregor taking on the role of a younger Obi-Wan Kenobi for the prequel trilogy, it became apparent that Obi-Wan was himself a master swordsman in both Ataru and Soresu, making him an acrobatic duelist who is able to turn into a defensive wizard by the end of the Clone Wars. To add on top of all of this, while Star Wars canon has quite honestly filled out almost every part of Obi-Wan Kenobi's entire lifetime, we are still missing a huge chunk of what Luke's life was like post Return of the Jedi and before The Force Awakens. And that period of time is very crucial for his development and the development of the Jedi as a whole, especially in the 15 years before he took on Ben Solo as his apprentice. So for me, it's always been a matchup to consider, but even more so now with some recent news. According to Stuart Beattie, who was the writer for Obi-Wan Kenobi when it was still planned as a movie, Obi-Wan was set to fight Luke in a vision that came to him at a Force shrine where he had found some refugees. In the vision, the long-exiled Obi-Wan is forced to fight an adult Luke who fell to the dark side on Mustafar, much like his father. Shaken by what he saw and forced to fight, Obi-Wan nearly dies by Luke's hand before he snaps out of the vision. Beattie realized that while the vision could serve as a parallel to the one Luke had of himself facing Vader in the Dagobah cave during Empire Strikes Back, it would contradict much of what Obi-Wan saw in Luke in the first place. Hope. For Luke, his vision was a warning of what could become of him if he fell to the dark side, which is why we see his face under the mask. If Obi-Wan killed Luke in the vision, perhaps Beattie saw that as Obi-Wan's fear and guilt overcoming his hope for Luke, which would be a delicate note to strike. With all that said, before getting into this matchup, I'll make sure to remind y'all of the 3 categories that I'm ranking, as well as the scenario that I have envisioned for this versus duel. The 3 categories being ranked are weapon abilities, followed by special abilities, and then notable other traits. Using these 3 categories and the current canon, I will then lay out a scenario where this imagined duel could potentially occur between these 2 legendary Jedi. With all that said, let's get into it. For the first category, I will look at their weapon abilities, which is lightsaber focused. Luke Skywalker can be considered perhaps the most talented scavenger when it comes to all forms of Jedi training, most notably lightsaber combat. While he was supremely gifted in it, he received very little direct training from either of his masters. While he trained with Obi-Wan Kenobi sparingly and with training remotes, he was guided by his former master's voice to areas where the Force was strong and other Jedi temples, which allowed him to pick up some unique lightsaber combat skills. He struggled severely in his first duels against Darth Vader on Cymoon 1 and Boba Fett at Obi-Wan Kenobi's old hut, but he made significant progress under the undercover Sergeant Creel on Gracchus the Hutt's Nar Shaddaa arena. This brutal and tough training served as a strong foundation for Luke's lightsaber combat moving forward. until he began his training with Yoda on Dagobah. Though he only spent a few weeks training with Master Yoda on Dagobah, it's speculated that the planet has some sort of force dilation which allowed him to gain extensive training, which he put heavily into use with his duel against Vader on Bespin. Though very skilled at this point, he was easily bested by his then revealed father, who chopped off his arm and left him devastated. He eventually recovered his confidence in the Force and himself and obtained a yellow lightsaber from an old High Republic Jedi outpost, where the twisted spirit of the Grand Inquisitor was forced to live on and engaged Luke in lightsaber combat, but was easily overwhelmed. By the time of Return of the Jedi, Luke had advanced so much to the point that he easily held his own against his father, and when he was finally egged on into anger, he unleashed his full raw ability and took down his father. Not much is known about Luke's lightsaber combat abilities and how they further developed after Return of the Jedi, but we do know that he trained Leia just a year after, and she was able to learn just enough that she was able to even defeat her brother during some sparring sessions. Luke also showcased his enhanced lightsaber abilities when he took down a whole hallway of dark troopers as he came to Grogu's rescue. While the canon replacement for the heir to the Empire should potentially showcase Luke at the prime of his lightsaber combat abilities, an older Luke was no slouch. At some point during the training of his young nephew Ben Solo, Luke fought against Snoke and disfigured his face, and years later encountered the Knights of Ren, who he easily destroyed in combat. Years later, Luke eventually fought 9 Sith Wraiths on Exegol during a Force vision that he had on Tython, and though he was able to hold his own, he was eventually saved by the ghost of his father. This encounter later led him directly to multiple duels against a former acolyte of the Beyond, called Kiza, who was possessed by the mask of the ancient Sith Lord Viceroy Exim Penchard, and wielded the lightsaber of Dark Noctis. And though we don't know what Luke did in 13 years before The Force Awakens, Luke Skywalker, 5 years into his exile, disconnected from the Force after Ben Solo's betrayal, is able to easily disarm Rey with an antenna stick against her staff before she draws his old lightsaber on him. Overall, while Luke has no traditional lightsaber style or training to his name, his willingness to learn from anyone and anything related to the Jedi allowed him to become a supreme combatant in lightsaber dueling, which allows him to stand toe-to-toe with the greatest Jedi and Sith of any era. While Luke's lightsaber training is entirely non-traditional, Obi-Wan's is one that is steeply invested in the Jedi Order's practices. As a youngling and a member of the Kaibut clan, Obi-Wan grew to become a very strong duelist acknowledged by both his peers and his eventual Jedi Master, Qui-Gon Jinn. Obi-Wan was assigned to Qui-Gon to temper his more rebellious nature at the time, and being the unorthodox Qui-Gon Jinn was, Obi-Wan was forced to go through repeated, tedious fundamental drills over and over again, delaying his choosing of Ataru as a fighting style. But these rigorous drills instilled in him crucial fundamentals that later served him well in a variety of situations. While we don't know the extent of how Obi-Wan developed his lightsaber combat during his apprenticeship, the duel at the Degenerator Room against Darth Maul showcased just how attuned he was with his master. Unfortunately, because he was trying to stay in tune with his master's strikes, he became susceptible to Force-amplified martial arts from Maul, who managed to kick the Den Padawan several floors down the Generator Room. After becoming separated from his master and seeing him struck down, Obi-Wan re-entered the duel full of rage and agility, chopping down Maul's lightsaber and employing much of his martial arts against him. However, Obi-Wan was unable to keep on his initial onslaught, and was nearly forced down the generator shaft by Darth Maul. Calling on the Force, he was able to jump over Maul and chop him down with his fallen master's lightsaber, becoming the first Jedi to defeat a Sith Lord in a millennia. In the decade after, Obi-Wan trained Anakin, who himself was a prodigy in lightsaber combat, though Obi-Wan proved time and time again that he knew how to take down his apprentice, as most notably showcased in their duel set just before Attack of the Clones. Though still very skilled, the events of the Attack of the Clones showcase an Obi-Wan who's not at the top of his game, seeing as he struggled against Jango Fett and almost fell down the Kaminoan walkways several times, and the later duel against Count Dooku. Though Anakin was initially knocked out by Dooku at the start of the duel, Obi-Wan only held up against Dooku for a short while. Count Dooku was Qui-Gon Jinn's master, and a specialist in the Makashi dueling art style, and he was able to play around with Obi-Wan, who was unable to gain any edge before chopping his shoulder and his thigh, making him unable to fight. Though it would appear that Obi-Wan was on the verge of becoming a lesser fighter, the outbreak of the Clone Wars ensured that his skills, like many Jedi, were honed to new levels. During the war, he often engaged in duels against many Sith acolytes and lightsaber users, as well as skilled bounty hunters and Mandalorians. Notably, he fought against Cad Bane and Pre Vizsla, who both used a lightsaber against him in a match of theirs. Against more traditional lightsaber users, Obi-Wan had a very strong record during the war. He easily bested Grievous in almost every encounter, forcing the general to retreat hastily. Though he often was in many flirtatious duels versus Asajj Ventress, he only ever took on very easy tactical retreats. He only ever had 3 duels against Savage Opress, and though he was overwhelmed the first time, he was able to escape the next time, before chopping off Savage's arm in their final duel. Maul's return to the galaxy at large proved to be one of the greatest dueling combat challenges for Obi-Wan throughout the entire war, as he often became unbalanced and came very close to losing every duel. Though Obi-Wan fought Dooku sparingly, and mostly with Anakin by his side, he continued to be outdueled in every fight, often falling and losing any edge against the Sith Lord. During their final duel on the Invisible Hand, Obi-Wan was once more outdueled by Dooku, who chokes him midair and knocks him unconscious against the bridge. But during the events of the film, he did manage to finally fully defeat General Grievous on Utapau, although in a more uncivilized manner. His first duel with the fallen Anakin, now Darth Vader, was one of the most elongated and tiring duels that the Jedi Master had ever faced, and he found himself often mirroring Anakin's moves or forced entirely on the defensive throughout the hellish landscape of Mustafar. Obi-Wan finally defeated his apprentice by taking on the high ground, goading him into taking an ill-advised jump, where he chopped off all his remaining organic limbs and leaving him to die. Broken from the destruction of the Republic and Jedi Order, as well as the betrayal of his brother, Obi-Wan went into exile and watched over Luke, but he mostly disconnected from the Force and never took up his lightsaber. He buried it for 9 years until he was forced to take on the mission to rescue Leia. There, he initially struggled to even draw out his lightsaber, only doing so when he forced Vader to abandon the random killings on Mapuza meant to draw him out. Their first encounter went extremely poorly, as the Jedi Master was easily overwhelmed and was dragged through ignited rocks as a form of revenge. However, as his spirit began to be reinvigorated by those around him, as well as the bacta treatment, the second duel went far better for the old Jedi Master. Though he was initially outclassed by Vader in their third duel, he was able to draw onto the Force and his hope in Luke and Leia, and take down his fallen apprentice through his melding of Ataru, Soresu, and some of Anakin's old lightsaber moves against him, defeating the Dark Lord and freeing himself of much of the trauma that he had carried. Years later, after his training with Yoda and Qui-Gon, the even more wizened Obi-Wan was sought out by Ezra through a trap laid by Maul. Facing Maul for one last time, he cut down the man in 3 contained moves, and freed him from his suffering. Obi-Wan's exile fully ended when Leia called for his aid during A New Hope, and though his 4th and final battle against Darth Vader was a muted affair, Obi-Wan found himself winning the duel in his own way, having seen the Skywalker twins reunited once more, and aware that he could not find it in himself to strike down his old apprentice for good. He surrenders to the Force and becomes one with it, ending the duel on his own terms. Both Luke and Obi-Wan are extremely skilled duelists, but I have to give the lightsaber combat category to Obi-Wan. He was trained by the Jedi Order and has working knowledge of all lightsaber forms, and has a formidable combination of the acrobatic Ataru and defensive Soresu that he can blend effortlessly. Having also faced a larger variety of duelists and notable fighters in their primes as he began to age out of his own, and his own later exploits against Darth Vader and Maul, gives him a serious edge over his apprentice Luke. Luke holds his own, having defeated many dark side users himself, but the mix of enemies he fought with were never on battlefields and often pushed his lightsaber combat abilities to their max, as they were cobbled together on a basis of need more than through years of training and practice application. For the second category, I'll be looking at special abilities, which are primarily Force related. While both men are very in tune with the Force and know many of the same abilities, they apply the Force in very different manners. Whereas lightsaber combat may be better learned through forums and drills, Luke showcases how a simple understanding of and opening to the Force provides greater opportunities to learn many abilities. While Luke was a fairly late learner of the Force, he learned how to quickly sense the cosmic and living Force around him, opening himself up to the planets and their Force secrets, as well as being able to sense and call his father and sister. He scored an impossible shot on the Death Star's exhaust port, which while many could have initially attested to his years shooting Womp Rats in his T-16 flying through Beggar's Canyon, was actually due to the calling of the Force to make the shot his targeting computer was simply unable to do. He learned telekinesis on his own during the events of Heir to the Jedi when he was taking apart Kulik's old lightsaber, and through sheer thought alone he learned how to move a fork. By the time of the Wampa Cave incident during The Empire Strikes Back, he could pull his lightsaber to himself with less of a struggle. But it was truly his training under Yoda where he became adept in telekinesis, lifting heavy stones and his master while meditating on his head. After his duel with his father, Luke was able to lash out with the Force and force the TIE fighters chasing after the Falcon to crash into each other, surprising himself. Luke also learned how to use telekinesis to force push and even crush his enemies, such as during his fight against the Dark Troopers in The Mandalorian, and even how to force choke his foes, like he did with the Gamorrean guards at Jabba's palace upon his arrival during Return of the Jedi. Luke was adept at using telekinesis as a whole, but he used the Force much more so to enhance his physical abilities, much like his father. He often made Force-enhanced jumps and kicks in his duels versus his father, showcasing a level of comfort with the Force even Jedi of the prequel era didn't immediately showcase. Luke was also heavily invested in the more hidden and mysterious abilities of the Force, as he often experienced Force visions and had working knowledge of dark side techniques such as the Mind Probe and Force Lightning. He also studied Force healing and knew how to disconnect from the Force, and a strengthening of his Force abilities in the following years post-Return of the Jedi made him more Force wizard than martial arts master. As a final act, his use of the Force projection to distract Kylo Ren and the First Order to give the Resistance remnants enough time to escape elevated his Force abilities to an entirely new level, though the strain of said ability was fatal. However, Luke was one of the few Jedi able to become a Force spirit and interact with the living world, which ensured that his presence remained constant for generations of Jedi to come. Whereas Luke progressively used the Force more for combat as a whole, Obi-Wan's more non-confrontational biases pushed him to use the Force more as a tool to soothe, connect, and distract. He was capable of using telekinesis to lift objects quite easily, and to a great level, as seen in his third duel versus Darth Vader. His Force push was also quite strong, as he frequently pushed the imposing General Grievous dozens of feet with a single push. He also managed to counter Anakin's Force push in their Mustafar duel, though he was finally flung backwards alongside the other man. Kenobi has been known to connect with and soothe living beings quite easily, as shown with his experiences on Ryloth and Lanahara. More so than anything else, Obi-Wan's skill with the Force Mind Trick and Force Flick on the Death Star showcased his willingness to keep things quiet and non-confrontational whenever possible, serving as an extension of his negotiation skills. He was so skilled with using the Force in this manner that he could even actively hide his usage of the Force far more easily than most Jedi ever could. And much like Luke, Obi-Wan was able to become a Force spirit through his training with Yoda and Qui-Gon. Though it should be noted, he was able to immediately give up his living body on command, as evidenced by his victorious surrender to Vader on the Death Star. As a whole, the philosophy of using the Force in circumstances comes into play here. No doubt, Obi-Wan could have gone on to become more experienced in more esoteric Force abilities had the Clone Wars not resulted in the destruction of the Jedi Order. But the destruction all but ensured that the Force abilities that kept him alive during the war would have to be used more discreetly, which minimized the full scope of his capabilities. He may have gone on to learn Force projection fit in with his philosophy of non-confrontation and distraction, but the need to use it for as long as Luke did would possibly have worried him. Obi-Wan at the end of the day simply has less Force potential than Luke, who benefited from spending much of his prime focused on improving his skills and knowledge for future students, whereas his first master had his chaotic father and the Clone Wars to deal with. Luke's ability to simply learn things without much guidance, and his ability to disconnect from the Force, and then to almost then immediately use his entire strength to convince even C-3PO that he was on Crate, showcases just how capable he was with the Force on command. We have also seen him use the Force more fluidly alongside his lightsaber combat as an older man versus the Knights of Ren, and I'd like to believe that whenever the eventual Heir to the Empire replacement arrives to Disney+, Luke Skywalker will showcase Force abilities that far outclass even his final heroic stand. This round therefore goes to Luke. For the final category, we'll look at other traits that are notable and could potentially affect this matchup. Luke is an experienced pilot, taking after his father's piloting skills and even managing to hold off his father in his first real use of an X-Wing fighter. This prowess with flying only continued to develop during the Galactic Civil War, where he was able to outmaneuver Charabay's A-Wing starfighter in a Lambda shuttle long enough to declare who he was. Luke's physical strength is rather impressive for his build, as he managed to fight off numerous aliens on Nar Shaddaa and Horix 3 with his bare hands, and take down stormtroopers with kicks and slams on Cymoon 1. Even as an older man, Luke could easily win an unarmed fight, such as how he easily disarmed Rey during their fight. Obi-Wan is a master strategist and extremely knowledgeable, and his push to find peaceful solutions even during wartime dubbed him the Negotiator. Although he could not make peaceful negotiations always, his wartime strategies and execution made him and Commander Cody's 212th Attack Battalion perhaps second only to the revered 501st, led by Anakin and Captain Rex. Like Luke, Obi-Wan was also a gifted pilot, as evidenced by his escape from Jango Fett's Slave One in the Geonosis rings, though he had come to hate flying due to the events of Bajal during his apprenticeship. Lastly, Obi-Wan was known for his understanding of many old languages, such as Twi'leki, Old Alderaanian, and Shirawak. So with a tie for the first two categories, and all their notable traits laid out, how could a potential duel play out? Here's the scenario I envision. Luke and Obi-Wan simply cannot fight at around the same age, as Obi-Wan was nearly 40 when Luke was born. Since I want to keep this duel as close as possible to the realm of reality, I would argue that this duel would be agreed upon as hotly contested, but never touching the dark side, non-lethal, and with no chopped limbs. These two are quite good at that. This duel would take place on Ossus, and lean heavily on the possibility of using the original Great Jedi Library as a neutral ground for both fighters. While not strictly canon, the Queldroma epics in canon heavily suggest that the Tales of the Jedi comics to be mostly canon, but aesthetic depictions would more than likely be played around with. Conveniently, the Jedi Temple and Library were so lost to time that multiple artistic depictions of it exist, and the Dark Empire comics show only parts of the destroyed insides. With the destruction of the library and temple, the Force would be more potent due to the collection of artifacts and effects of the local fauna, which would be more greatly connected to the Force than the average planet. As such, I envision Obi-Wan's Force Ghost appearing before Luke on Ossus between 8 and 15 ABY, after Grogu's departure, but before Ben Solo's apprenticeship. Obi-Wan would suggest a competitive duel to test Luke's skill, which Luke would assume to be a Force-based one. Out of humility and misguided thinking, Luke would expect to lose to his master, being as he was one with the Force and not of the flesh. Kenobi would dismiss this concern, and would suggest the Maze Chamber of Antiquities as their location for the duel. Luke would make his way to the Maze Chamber and find himself lost after a while, before stumbling upon a hooded figure. The man would lift up his hood and reveal himself to be Obi-Wan Kenobi, looking as he did during the Revenge of the Sith. Luke would question how his old master looked so much younger and back in his body, and question if the dark side was in play here. But the old visage of Obi-Wan would flicker in place to reassure Luke that the library had grown and changed in mysterious ways that allowed him to be in a place as close as alive to possible, before showcasing other versions of him during his life. Settling back in his Revenge of the Sith form, Obi-Wan would draw out his lightsaber and enter into his Soresu stance, and Luke would draw out his lightsaber. The duel would then commence. Obi-Wan and Luke would remain rather evenly matched, with Luke at this time more knowledgeable of the traditional Jedi forms and able to keep up with Obi-Wan's Soresu and Utaru mastery. While Obi-Wan would easily press his advantage at times, Luke's martial prowess and his willingness to hack and slash with Force would keep Obi-Wan at bay. Obi-Wan would catch Luke with a powerful Force push or two, but Luke's raw Force abilities would allow him to keep Obi-Wan's Force abilities neutralized in the same way his father had during the Mustafar duel. Seeing that Luke was able to hold his own, and taking some surprise pushes and pulls that would remind Obi-Wan of the bad times of Dooku, Obi-Wan would escape through the maze, taking the time to figure out the layout for the next skirmish. Luke would pursue, but the maze would shift differently for him, with the layout changing due in part to the visions and Obi-Wan's desire for some time for strategizing. Realizing that Obi-Wan would not come to him and that he would wait for Luke and explore the temple for his advantages further, Luke would take a seat to meditate and reach out with his Force sense to guide him towards Obi-Wan. Once he was able to locate Obi-Wan and find him, Luke would immediately be surprised by an Obi-Wan jumping out from a ceiling of darkness, uttering the iconic line, "Hello there," and take the fight to Luke in a manner similar to his second duel with Vader in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. With Luke seemingly on the defensive only and not using any telekinesis, Obi-Wan would find himself confused by his student's lackluster showing. Having witnessed the prodigious Luke for years and during the heir to the Empire replacement from afar, Obi-Wan would then realize that Luke had duped him. Luke would be using a lesser version of the Falanasi Force projection ability, which explained why the doppelganger wasn't using the Force. Quickly disarming and cutting through the visage, Luke's image would disappear, and the real Luke would kick through the fading image and catch Obi-Wan straight in the chest. Obi-Wan would once more make a hasty retreat, but this time with Luke on his tail. Making his image and footsteps all but disappear after a quick burst of force speed, Obi-Wan would stop in front of the office of the Chamber of Antiquities, rearranging the 4 tapestries outside the guarded entrance in the correct order of the Jedi mantra. There is no emotion. There is peace. There is no ignorance. There is knowledge. There is no passion. There is serenity. There is no chaos. There is harmony. Obi-Wan can't help but give Luke one more lesson on the Force and the Jedi, especially as he truly starts his academy. And what better than 4 of the 5 tenets of the Jedi mantra? Luke quickly finds the tapestries once more rearranged and tries to move forward, but sees the stone guardians begin to activate. Stepping back, he ponders the 4 tapestries and places them in the right order, walking into the office chamber to face his master for one last round. Obi-Wan would strike at Luke, who would use the Force Stasis technique to slow down his old master in a similar manner to Cal Kestis, as opposed to Kylo Ren. Surprised by the ability, Obi-Wan would slowly turn around and see what his Padawan was doing. Luke would kneel down at the great chair Obi-Wan had positioned himself in front of, and lift up the sprawled Drathos skeleton with the Force with one hand. With his lightsaber buckled away, he would use his other hand to lift up the dirty rug underneath the skeleton and snap it in the air in one move. Obi-Wan would stare at such a strange act and would begin to feel the Force stasis wear off. Just as he jumps up to strike at Luke, now facing him, lightsaber deactivated, Obi-Wan would stop, open his mouth, and smile. The rug was the 5th tapestry, the final tenet of the Jedi mantra. There is no death. There is the Force. Luke would utter the words with a smile, and suddenly the dusty room would swirl in place, and look as it did during the fabled Queldroma epics. Obi-Wan and Luke would both be stunned, and turn to face the skeleton reanimated. Sitting in the great chair, the legendary Jedi Master, Odan Dur. He would look at Luke and Obi-Wan, and smile and nod to both of them, and say, "Welcome, Masters." The vision would end just as quickly as it came. Obi-Wan would then walk over to Luke, once more looking like old Ben Kenobi. He would then tell Luke, "You have won, young Luke, and I am prouder than you can possibly imagine." And with that, Obi-Wan fades away, and Luke ends an adventurous duel and begins to examine the chamber for lost Jedi secrets and knowledge. Thanks for watching this Luke vs. Obi-Wan duel. I for sure could have had Luke beat Obi-Wan more concretely, but I think it speaks to how Luke constantly learns from his mistakes, and a younger Luke would value the Jedi Code more so than a Force spirit, allowing him metaphorical victory that his master would willingly give with pride. Let me know what you thought of my scenario and the video as a whole down below in the comments, and make sure to comment how you think this duel would have gone in your own words. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, as we are on the march to 1,000 subs, and every subscription really helps us get closer to spreading our takes on Star Wars with all of you guys. If you're more of an audio podcast fan, you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Anchor, and Spotify. If you haven't already, make sure to follow us on our social media, where you can find us on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks again for checking out the Star Wars Lads Versus episode. We'll see you all again next time on Wednesday when our Andor Episode 5 review drops. Until then,